Once a person has been authenticated, they've been validated, verified, and proven that they are who they say they are, through something they know, something they have, or something there are. Now we have to give them certain rights or privileges on the system. Okay, yes, you're allowed to log in, but now what can you do? And this is what we'll call then authorization. Authorization would only be granted to a user that has already been authenticated. And this indicates then what are the rights, privileges, or permissions that are then granted to that user who has now been authenticated. Some of the common expressions here for authorization, well, CRUD, create, read, update, delete. We also have others such as full control. The idea, of course, is that if a person only needs read access, only give them read level access. If they need write-only access, well, don't give them read. So the idea behind this is that authorization should be based on a person's job needs and job responsibilities. This is very often then based on the implementation of the concept of least privilege, only giving a person the level of access they need in order to do their job, but of course only for the time period for which they actually need it as well. This also supports the concept of need to know. Need to know quite often comes after least privilege. Least privilege says, can you see, for example, a certain piece of information, or do you have access to something? Do you need that as part of your job responsibilities? So these two terms are very much used interchangeably, even though they are slightly different. In some cases, a person might have need to know. Yes, they can see a credit card number, but least privilege says it's read only. In other cases, a person would only have a level of access to a building at a certain time of day, what we call temporal isolation, and that's a form of then least privilege. In many cases, authorization is managed then by access control lists, or ACLs. Now, an access control list could be based on listing all of the users and what their privileges on the system are. Or in some cases, it could be based on groups. People that have similar or even identical privileges are grouped together, and a person gets access based on their group membership. Everyone within this group has a certain level of access. We also use access control lists on places like firewalls, where it can be a universal rule that applies to everybody, that turns around and says you can't go to this site. The idea of an access control list is that it could be either based on the perspective from the subject that says what can this user do, or it could also be based from the perspective of the object that says who can read this file. Both of those are managed usually through some type of access control list. Now, the challenges with access control is that, well, in many cases we see a person's level of access far exceeds what their actual business requirements are. This is why access control systems should be frequently monitored and reviewed. We should go through the system and find out when people are trying to get access to a system that they shouldn't be. Or we can look at what activities has a person done, and are those certainly then appropriate for their current job responsibility. Frequent monitoring and review is an important part then of managing access in accordance with the person's current business requirements. Now, this does become a problem. In many cases, access control may not be managed in a consistent manner. Each manager may do things the way they think is best, regardless of maybe how they say it should be done in the head office. So the idea for us as auditors is often look for these places of inconsistency, where a person's access is being managed in a way that is against the principles of least privilege and need to know, because their local manager doesn't care to properly enforce the rules. The other challenge is that we should always have this concept of separation of duties. Separation of duties says that no one person controls an entire transaction from its inception through to its completion. This especially deals with things like financial transactions. If a person is going to make a deposit, well, somebody else should validate that deposit before it's approved and submitted, just to make sure that the money was deposited into the right account in the right way. So the idea here of then separation of duties is we can prevent mistakes and we can prevent fraud by requiring two people to work together to actually execute a certain task. Now, there's many ways to implement separation of duties, such as dual control, mutual exclusivity. But the point, of course, is to try to avoid collusion. And collusion is where the two people that are supposed to then provide a balance or a check for each other begin to work together to circumvent the separation of duties principles. So how do we control access? Well, access starts physically. Who gets into our building? And we do this, of course, through fences, cameras, doors, locks. There's a number of different physical access controls that are important. In fact, when we do penetration tests, we often then stress the importance of a physical access control attack. Many companies that execute a penetration test take entirely a logical or technical view of that test. The problem with this is that it does not then remember that if a person gets access to a server room, then they own that company's systems. So even if a company is quite secure from a technical perspective, if they have a problem with physical access, then all of those good technical controls result in no benefit. We control access through people logging in remotely, trying to make sure that they use secure VPNs so that only authorized people will be able to get access, and that any data they are transmitting then is hidden from any type of an attacker. The risk always is where a person has the option to bypass the controls. They can quite simply disable a control while they do something wrong. So this is where, of course, we have to emphasize the importance for our administrators that they do not tamper with the logs. They do not in some way try to hide their activity. This, of course, has become even simpler in today's wireless world. Where with a wired connection, you had to find a port on a wall to connect to. Now a person can log their laptop in over their phone, and being able then to use the phone network for their confidential data, well, the risk again, is it true that someone is able to get in and monitor our traffic and so on?